The autumn rain fell steadily on the winding roads of Cedar Valley, Pennsylvania, as Detective Sarah Coleman pulled into the muddy construction site just after dawn. For 18 years she had worked missing persons cases, but nothing had prepared her for the call that came through dispatch at 6:23 a.m. Construction crew digging foundation for new shopping center has uncovered what appears to be a school bus buried beneath 12 feet of earth. License plates match a cold case from 1987. Sarah sat in her patrol car for a moment. Engine running, windshield wipers cutting through the gray morning light. She knew this case intimately. 14 children and their teacher had vanished during a field trip to Pine Ridge Nature Center on October 15, 1987. She had been one of the intended passengers, a third grader at Valley Springs Elementary, but had stayed home with strep throat that day. The guilt had shaped her entire career in law enforcement. The memories came flooding back as she stared at the excavation site. She remembered that October morning clearly, watching from her bedroom window as her classmates boarded the familiar blue and white bus, their excited voices carrying across the street. Amy Jennings had waved at her from the back window, pressing her face against the glass and making silly faces to cheer up her sick friend. That was the last time Sarah ever saw Amy smile. The construction foreman, a weathered man named Pete Kowalski, met her at the excavation site. His hard hat was muddy, his expression grim. "Ma'am, we found it around midnight when the night crew was working. Stopped everything the moment we realized what it was." Sarah approached the partially uncovered vehicle. The blue and white paint was still visible in patches, though rust and earth had claimed most of the surface. The familiar logo of Valley Springs School District could still be made out on the side. What struck her most was how intact it appeared, as if it had been deliberately buried rather than abandoned. The bus had been positioned at an angle, nose down, as if it had been driven into a pre-dug pit. The rear emergency exit was partially exposed, and Pete's crew had managed to clear enough debris to access the door. The methodical nature of the burial suggested this was no accident. Someone had taken considerable time and effort to hide this vehicle. "Any sign of—" she began. "Empty," Pete said quietly. "Not a soul inside. But there's something else you need to see." He led her to the rear emergency exit, which had been carefully pried open by his crew. Inside, the seats were still arranged in neat rows, covered in decades of dust and decay. Personal belongings were scattered throughout: a Star Wars lunchbox, still containing a moldy sandwich, a purple backpack with Amy J. written in marker, sneakers that would have fit a 9-year-old, and a small teddy bear wedged between two seats. What caught Sarah's attention was a message written in faded marker on the back of one seat. "We never made it to Pine Ridge, help us. October 1987. Below it, in different handwriting, someone had added, "They moved us 3 times. Look for the eagle sign. Amy knows where." Sarah stepped back out of the bus, her mind racing. Someone had been alive long enough after the disappearance to write that message. Someone had known they were in trouble and had tried to leave a clue for the future. The reference to Amy made her heart race. Her best friend had somehow managed to leave breadcrumbs for anyone who might come looking. The autumn wind picked up, rustling through the trees that surrounded the construction site. Sarah noticed something else disturbing about the location. This wasn't a random burial spot. The construction was taking place on land that had once belonged to the Millbrook Industrial Complex, a series of warehouses and storage facilities that had been abandoned in the late 1980s. Someone with knowledge of the area's development plans would have known this land wouldn't be disturbed for decades. Within 2 hours, the site was crawling with state investigators, forensic teams, and media vans. Sarah coordinated the scene while trying to process what this discovery meant. The official investigation in 1987 had concluded that the bus had likely gone off a mountain road in a storm, with the vehicle and occupants swept away by floodwaters. But buses don't bury themselves 12 feet underground with such precision. Detective Mike Harrison from the state police arrived to take over the investigation. Sarah had worked with him before and trusted his thoroughness. As he examined the bus, she briefed him on the original case. The teacher who vanished with the children was Miss Rebecca Hartley. Sarah explained. 24 years old, first-year educator who had volunteered to accompany the field trip. Beloved by the kids and staff. The bus driver was supposed to be Frank Morrison, our regular driver. But he called in sick that morning. The substitute was Thomas Mills, a part-time employee, with limited background information available. Harrison made notes as she spoke. What do we know about Mills? That's where it gets interesting. Mills had only been with the district for 2 weeks, hired as emergency temporary help. Clean driving record. But his previous employment history was sketchy. Said he'd been driving for a private transport company in Ohio that we could never verify existed. As the forensic team processed the scene, Sarah drove to the Valley Springs Public Library to review the original case files. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, remembered the incident vividly. "Such a tragedy," she said, pulling the archived newspaper coverage from a filing cabinet. 14 families lost their children that day. The whole town was in mourning for years. Some families moved away, couldn't bear to stay. The Jennings family stayed, though. Mrs. Jennings never gave up hope that Amy would come home. Sarah spread the yellowed newspapers across a reading table. The headlines told the story. School bus missing in mountain storm. Search continues for Valley Springs children. Investigation expanded after bus not found in river. She studied the photos of the missing children, remembering some of their faces from her own classroom. The original investigation had been thorough for its time. Search teams had combed the mountains for weeks. Helicopters had surveyed the river systems. Divers had searched every accessible body of water. The FBI had been called in after a week, when it became clear this wasn't a simple accident. But without the bus or any physical evidence, the trail had gone cold. One article caught her attention. A follow-up piece from 6 months after the disappearance. It mentioned that several families had received strange phone calls in the weeks following the incident. Callers who claimed to have information but would only whisper brief messages before hanging up. The police had investigated but found no leads. Sarah made note of this detail. In her experience, such calls often came from perpetrators who enjoyed taunting victim families, but occasionally they came from victims themselves, trying to communicate under dangerous circumstances. That afternoon, Sarah visited the Pine Ridge Nature Center, the intended destination for the field trip. The facility was still operational, though under different management. The current director, a man named David Chen, walked her through the grounds. "We've heard about the bus discovery," he said. "It's brought back a lot of difficult memories for our staff. Several of our older employees were here in 1987. The Nature Center sat on 200 acres of preserved woodland, with hiking trails, wildlife exhibits, and educational facilities. It was exactly the kind of place third graders would have been excited to visit, full of animals, interactive displays, and outdoor adventures." Chen introduced her to Margaret Foster, a naturalist who had worked at Pine Ridge for over 30 years. Margaret's eyes were sad as she recounted that October day. "We waited for hours," Margaret said. "The bus was supposed to arrive at 10 a.m. for the autumn ecology program. When they didn't show up by noon, we called the school. That's when we learned they had never arrived anywhere." "Did you notice anything unusual in the days before the trip?" Sarah asked. Margaret hesitated. "There was something. A man came by the center about a week before, asking questions about our security, our staff schedules, our daily routines. Said he was a concerned parent, but something felt off about him. He was too interested in details that a parent wouldn't normally care about." "Can you describe him?" "Medium height, brown hair, probably in his 30s. He had a beard and wore glasses. Very polite, but his questions were strange. He wanted to know what time we locked up, whether we had security cameras, how many staff members would be on duty during school visits. We reported it to the police, but nothing came of it." Sarah made detailed notes. This was the first she'd heard of anyone scouting the location beforehand. It suggested premeditation and planning, which aligned with the careful burial of the bus. As evening approached, Sarah drove to her childhood neighborhood, parking outside the house where she had grown up. 3 doors down was the former home of Amy Jennings, one of the missing children. Amy had been Sarah's best friend, and her absence had left a hole in Sarah's heart that never quite healed. The house looked smaller than Sarah remembered, but otherwise unchanged. The same maple tree stood in the front yard where she and Amy had built countless snow forts and held summer picnics. A tire swing still hung from one of the lower branches, though it was weathered and unused now. Mrs. Jennings still lived in the same house, now in her 70s and walking with a cane. She invited Sarah in for tea, and they sat in a living room that seemed frozen in time. Photos of Amy at age 8 still decorated the mantelpiece, along with school artwork and a collection of ceramic horses she had loved. "I never gave up hope," Mrs. Jennings said quietly. "Even when everyone else accepted that they were gone, I kept believing Amy would come home someday. Now, with this bus discovery, maybe we'll finally get answers." The house felt like a shrine to a missing child. Amy's bedroom had been preserved exactly as she'd left it that October morning. "Mrs. Jennings, do you remember receiving any strange phone calls after Amy disappeared?" Well, the older woman's eyes widened. "How did you know about that?" "I told the police, but they said it was probably a prank. Someone would call late at night and whisper Amy's name, then hang up. It happened maybe 6 or 7 times over the first year." Sarah leaned forward. "Did the voice sound like a child or an adult?" "That's the thing," Mrs. Jennings said. "It sounded like a child, but trying to disguise their voice, like they were scared to be heard." "The last call was different though," the voice said. "Tell Sarah, I remember the eagle." Then, the line went dead. Sarah's blood ran cold. The eagle, the same reference from the message in the bus. Amy had been trying to communicate, to leave clues that only Sarah would understand. But what was the significance of the eagle? As she drove home that night, Sarah racked her brain trying to remember any connection between Amy and eagles. Then it hit her, Camp Wildwood. The summer camp they had both attended the year before, the disappearance had an eagle as its mascot. There had been a large wooden eagle carving over the main entrance gate. But Camp Wildwood had closed in 1985, after financial difficulties and allegations of mismanagement. The property had been abandoned ever since, sitting empty in the hills outside town. The next morning brought a breakthrough. The forensic team had discovered a hidden compartment beneath one of the bus seats, accessible only by removing a panel that had been carefully replaced. Inside was a small plastic bag containing 14 school ID cards and a folded piece of paper. Sarah examined the note with trembling hands, written in a child's careful handwriting. "They took us to the old summer camp in Cedar Valley, the one that closed down. Mr. Mills wasn't really our driver. His real name is Gabriel Stone. Miss Hartley tried to help us, but they took her away. If you find this, look for the eagle sign. We are trying to be brave, but we are scared. Please find us. Amy Jennings for everyone." Sarah's breath caught. Amy had managed to hide this message, a lifeline thrown across decades of silence. The old summer camp Amy referenced was Camp Wildwood, which had closed in 1985 after a scandal involving its management. The property had been abandoned ever since. More importantly, they now had a real name for the fake bus driver: Gabriel Stone. Sarah immediately ran the name through the criminal database and found multiple hits. Stone was a known associate of several cult groups that had operated in Pennsylvania and surrounding states during the 1980s and 1990s. Within an hour, Sarah was leading a team toward the overgrown entrance of Camp Wildwood. The property sat on 60 acres of dense forest, dotted with decaying cabins, and a main lodge that had succumbed to years of neglect. The eagle sign Amy had mentioned was still visible, the carved wooden emblem hanging crookedly over the entrance gate, weathered but recognizable. The silence was oppressive as they made their way through the abandoned camp. Cabins that had once housed laughing children now stood empty, their windows broken, their doors hanging open like mouths frozen in silent screams. Poison ivy and wild vines had claimed most of the structures, turning them into green monuments to abandonment. As they searched the grounds, one of the investigators called out from behind the main lodge, He had found a root cellar, its wooden doors covered by years of fallen leaves and debris. The lock was rusted, but had clearly been used long after the camp's official closure. Recent scratches in the metal suggested it had been accessed within the last few decades. Sarah descended into the cellar with 2 other officers. The space was larger than expected, with multiple rooms carved into the hillside. The air was stale and cold, but there were signs of habitation: old bedding, empty canned goods, battery-powered lanterns with corroded batteries. On one wall, carved into the wooden support beams, were 14 names, the names of the missing children. But there was more. In one of the deeper rooms, they found evidence that this space had been used as a makeshift school. Child-sized desks and chairs were arranged in rows, facing a blackboard where someone had written lessons in faded chalk. The lessons weren't normal curriculum, though. They were indoctrination materials, filled with references to the family and Father Gabriel. In the furthest room, they found something that made Sarah's heart race: a collection of journals, handwritten in various young voices, documenting years of captivity. The entries painted a horrifying picture of children held against their will, moved between different locations, their captors using them for forced labor and psychological manipulation. One journal, written in Amy's familiar handwriting, provided the most detail. The children had been taken by a group calling themselves the Family, led by a man who insisted they call him Father Gabriel. The real bus driver, Frank Morrison, had been threatened into calling in sick that morning. Thomas Mills, whose real name was Gabriel Stone, had been planted as the substitute driver specifically to abduct the children. Miss Hartley had indeed tried to protect the children, and had paid a terrible price for her courage. According to Amy's journal, the young teacher had attempted to overpower Stone when she realized what was happening, but had been subdued and taken to a separate location. The children never saw her again after their first week in captivity. The journals revealed the systematic way the cult had attempted to break down the children's identities. They were given new names, forbidden to speak of their past lives, and subjected to constant indoctrination. Those who resisted were punished with isolation, food deprivation, and psychological abuse. But the most shocking revelation came in Amy's final entry, dated 3 years after the disappearance. "Some of us are going to try to escape tonight. If we don't make it, I hope someone finds these books someday. They're planning to move us again tomorrow, somewhere far away where they say no one will ever find us. Michael and Lisa are too scared to try, but David said he'd come with me. We're going to head for the highway and try to flag down a police car. Sarah Coleman was supposed to be with us that day. I'm glad she wasn't, but I wish she was here now. She'd know what to do. Tell her we never forgot about her. And tell her about the eagle. She'll understand." Well, Sarah wiped away tears as she read her friend's words. Amy had been thinking of her even in those dark circumstances, believing somehow that Sarah would be the one to eventually find these clues and piece together the truth. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the horror. The Family had been a cult operating in the region for over a decade, moving between abandoned properties and using them to hide their criminal activities. They had been responsible for multiple disappearances across 3 states, targeting children and young adults who could be easily controlled and manipulated. Gabriel Stone, the cult's leader, had been a charismatic figure who preyed on vulnerable people and those seeking spiritual guidance. He had convinced his followers that mainstream society was corrupt and that they needed to create their own isolated community. Children were seen as particularly valuable because they could be shaped and molded from a young age. DNA evidence from the cellar confirmed that the children had been held there for at least several years, but the journals indicated that by 1990, the group had begun to fracture due to internal conflicts and pressure from law enforcement investigating other crimes in surrounding areas. A breakthrough came when investigators tracked down a former cult member who had left the group in 1989. Maria Santos, now living under a new identity in Arizona, agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Her testimony revealed that several of the children had survived into the 1990s, though they had been given new names and identities. The older children were the most resistant. Maria explained during her interview at FBI headquarters. Amy Jennings in particular never stopped trying to escape or help the others. Gabriel saw her as a threat to the group's cohesion. She was always planning, always whispering to the other kids, always trying to keep their real memories alive. "What happened to her?" Sarah asked. Maria's face grew dark. There was an escape attempt in late 1990. Amy and 3 other children tried to run during a supply trip to town. 2 of them were caught immediately. But Amy and a boy named David Patterson made it several miles before they were recaptured. And then, Gabriel was furious. He decided Amy was too dangerous to keep with the group. "The last time I saw her, she was maybe 13 or 14. They were moving her to a family's in Oregon, other cult members who would keep her isolated until she could be fully reprogrammed." Working with federal authorities, Sarah helped coordinate a multi-state search for the surviving children, now adults in their 30s. The investigation led them to a compound in rural Oregon, where they found 3 survivors: Amy Jennings, now called Jennifer Walsh, Michael Torres, formerly David Patterson, and Lisa Chen, previously known as Christina Valdez. The reunion was emotional and complex. The survivors had endured years of psychological manipulation and had built new lives on foundations of enforced forgetfulness. Amy, in particular, struggled with recovered memories of her childhood and the trauma of captivity. "I never forgot the bus ride," Amy told Sarah during their first meeting in over 30 years. "I remembered you being sick that day, watching from your bedroom window. For years I held on to that memory like an anchor. It reminded me that there was a real world out there, a life I had before everything changed." Amy had aged into a woman who bore little resemblance to the carefree 8-year-old Sarah remembered. Her hair was prematurely gray. Her eyes held depths of sorrow that no child should ever know, and she moved with the careful, measured steps of someone who had learned not to trust the world around her. "They tried to make us forget our real names, our families, everything about our past," Amy continued. "But I used to whisper your name to myself every night, along with my mother's name and my address. It was like a prayer, keeping those memories alive." The compound in Oregon had been raided based on Maria Santos's information. The FBI found evidence of ongoing criminal activity, including identity fraud, child abuse, and financial crimes. Several cult members were arrested, though many others had scattered to the wind when they learned of the investigation. Lisa Chen, now 39, had been the youngest of the captives at age 6 when she was taken. She had virtually no memory of her life before the cult and struggled with basic social interactions. She had been kept in near-complete isolation for most of her captivity, used primarily for manual labor, and as a subject for psychological experiments. Michael Torres had fared somewhat better, having been placed with a cult family in Nevada who had treated him more like a foster son than a prisoner. However, he still bore the psychological scars of his early captivity and had difficulty forming meaningful relationships or trusting authority figures. The investigation revealed that 4 of the children had died during captivity, victims of neglect, abuse, and untreated medical conditions. The cult leaders had been careful to leave no trace of these deaths, and the bodies were never recovered. Miss Rebecca Hartley had also been killed in 1988 when she attempted to contact law enforcement after escaping from her captors. As for the remaining 7 children, some had been adopted by cult families and taken to various parts of the country. The FBI continued searching for them, though the trail was decades cold and complicated by false identities and destroyed records. Some might be living normal lives under assumed names, unaware of their true origins. Others might still be trapped within the cult's network, afraid to come forward or unaware that rescue was possible. The discovery at Valley Springs led to one of the largest missing children investigations in Pennsylvania history. Several cult members were arrested and charged with kidnapping, child abuse, and murder. Gabriel Stone had died in 1994 during a confrontation with police in Montana, taking many secrets to his grave. For Sarah, the case brought a mixture of closure and renewed purpose. She had found her friend after 35 years, but the cost had been devastating. Amy struggled with integration back into society, requiring extensive therapy and support to rebuild her sense of identity and learn to trust again. "Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I had been on that bus," Sarah confided to Amy during one of their regular meetings. "Don't," Amy replied firmly. "You became exactly who you needed to become. You're the one who found us. You're the one who remembered us when the world forgot. You're the one who understood the clues I left behind." The psychological evaluation reports painted a harrowing picture of what the survivors had endured. Years of systematic abuse, isolation, and indoctrination had left deep scars that might never fully heal. But there were also remarkable signs of resilience. The way Amy had preserved her memories despite intense pressure to forget, how she had continued to care for the younger children even under terrible circumstances, and how she had never stopped hoping for rescue. Dr. Patricia Wells, the psychiatrist working with the survivors, explained the long-term impacts. These individuals were subjected to sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques designed to destroy their sense of self and replace it with cult ideology. The fact that any of them maintained their core identity is extraordinary. The Valley Springs case led to changes in how missing children investigations were conducted, with greater emphasis on cult activity and child trafficking. New protocols were established for tracking down substitute workers and temporary employees who might be used to gain access to children. The town erected a memorial to the 14 children and Miss Hartley, honoring both those who had been found and those who were still missing. The memorial featured a bronze sculpture of children holding hands, with an inscription reading, "Their names will never be forgotten. Their courage will always be remembered." But the investigation was far from over. Each survivor who was found provided new leads, new names, new locations to search. The cult had operated a network spanning multiple states, and authorities suspected there might be dozens of additional victims who had never been reported missing, or whose disappearances had been attributed to other causes. Amy's testimony proved invaluable in mapping the cult's operations. Her exceptional memory and attention to detail helped investigators identify numerous properties where the group had operated, leading to the discovery of additional evidence and the rescue of other victims from different cases. She was like a living history book. Detective Harrison noted, even after all those years and all the trauma, she could remember specific details about locations, people, and events that helped us piece together the full scope of what these people had been doing. The financial investigation revealed that the cult had been funding its operations through a complex network of fraud, theft, and exploitation. Members were required to turn over all personal assets when they joined, and the children were often used for labor that generated income for the group. Some of the older children had been forced to participate in online fraud schemes, using their youth and innocence to gain the trust of potential victims. 6 months after the initial discovery, investigators found another hidden facility in an abandoned mine shaft in West Virginia. This location had served as a training center where new cult members learned techniques for psychological manipulation and control. Documents found at the site revealed the systematic methods used to break down victims' resistance and rebuild their identities according to cult doctrine. The mineshaft facility also contained records that helped investigators understand the full scope of the cult's operations. Over a 15-year period, the family had been responsible for the disappearance of at least 47 children and adults across 6 states. Some had been recruited voluntarily by family members who joined the cult, while others, like the Valley Springs children, had been abducted outright. Years later, Sarah would sometimes drive past the memorial on her way to work. She would think about the children who had been recovered, slowly rebuilding their lives, and those who were still out there somewhere, perhaps with families who had no idea of their true origins. The case had taught her that some disappearances were not accidents or tragedies of nature, but deliberate acts of evil carried out by those who preyed on the innocent. But it had also shown her the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the power of never giving up hope. Amy Jennings had survived 30 years of darkness and manipulation, yet she had never truly forgotten who she was or where she came from. Her hidden message in the bus had been a beacon across time, a promise that truth would eventually surface, no matter how deep it was buried. As Sarah continued her work in missing persons, she carried Amy's lesson with her that even in the darkest circumstances, someone is always trying to find their way home. And sometimes, if they're lucky, someone like Sarah is out there, never stopping the search, never forgetting their name. The Valley Springs mystery had been solved, but it had opened doors to questions that might never be fully answered. How many other buses were buried in forgotten places? How many other children had left messages that had yet to be found? How many families were still waiting for news that might never come? But Sarah had learned that every case mattered. Every missing person deserved to be searched for, and every family deserved the truth, no matter how long it took to uncover. The children of Valley Springs had waited 35 years for justice. Others might wait even longer, but they would not be forgotten. The ongoing investigation continued to yield results. 3 more survivors were located over the following year, each reunion bringing both joy and heartbreak, as families were reunited with children who were now middle-aged adults, forever changed by their experiences. Dr. Wells established a specialized treatment program for cult survivors, drawing on lessons learned from working with the Valley Springs survivors. The program became a model for similar facilities across the country, helping other victims of ritualistic abuse and psychological manipulation rebuild their lives. Amy eventually decided to become an advocate for missing children and cult survivors. Despite her own ongoing struggles with trauma and trust, she found purpose in helping other families navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges that came with reunion after decades of separation. Every story matters, Amy would tell the families she worked with. Every person who disappears leaves a hole in the world that can only be filled by their return. We never stop hoping. We never stop searching. And we never stop believing that truth will find its way to the surface. The partnership between Amy and Sarah continued for years, with Amy serving as a consultant on difficult missing persons cases. Her insights into the mindset of both captors and victims proved invaluable in solving other cold cases and preventing new abductions. 10 years after the bus discovery, a documentary film crew came to Valley Springs to chronicle the story. The film, titled The Eagle's Message, won several awards and helped raise awareness about missing children and the lasting impact of childhood trauma. Amy agreed to participate in the film, hoping that her story might help other survivors find the courage to come forward. In one of the film's most powerful moments, Amy stood beside the memorial in Valley Springs and spoke directly to any survivors who might be watching. If you're out there, if you remember who you used to be, know that someone is looking for you. Know that you are not forgotten. Know that the world is ready to welcome you home. The film's release led to several new tips and potential sightings of other missing Valley Springs children. While most proved to be false leads, one call came from a woman in California who believed she might be Christina Valdez, one of the children who had never been found. DNA testing confirmed her identity, bringing the number of recovered survivors to 4. Sarah often reflected on the strange twists of fate that had shaped her life. A childhood illness had saved her from abduction, but it also placed her in the unique position to solve the case decades later. Her guilt over missing that fateful field trip had driven her to become a detective, which ultimately led to finding her missing friends. Maybe everything happens for a reason, she mused to Amy during one of their regular meetings. Maybe you were meant to survive so you could leave those clues. Maybe I was meant to miss that bus, so I could be the one to find them. Amy smiled sadly. I used to think that way, trying to find meaning in all the suffering. But I think the meaning comes from what we do with the experiences we're given, not from the experiences themselves. You didn't just find us, Sarah. You saved us. And that choice to keep searching, to keep caring, that's what matters. In the end, that was what separated the disappeared from the truly lost. Someone who refused to stop looking. Someone who kept their memory alive. Someone who believed that truth, like spring water, would always find a way to surface, no matter how deep it had been buried. And sometimes, just sometimes, that belief was rewarded with the sound of a familiar voice saying, I knew you'd find me. I never stopped believing you would come. The Valley Springs case became a landmark in missing persons investigations, proving that even the coldest cases could be solved with persistence, technology, and a little bit of luck. It showed that truth has a way of surfacing, that victims can survive the unthinkable, and that the bonds between friends can endure across decades and through the darkest circumstances. Most importantly, it demonstrated that no one is ever truly forgotten as long as someone cares enough to keep looking. In a world where children could vanish without a trace, where families could be torn apart by evil, there were still people like Sarah Coleman who would never give up hope, never stop searching, and never forget a name. The eagle had finally delivered its message across the years, carried on the wings of memory and love, proving that even in the darkest places hope could survive, truth could endure, and lost children could find their way home. 15 years later, the ripple effect. 15 years had passed since Detective Sarah Coleman first stepped out of her patrol car at that muddy construction site, but the reverberations of the Valley Springs discovery continued to reshape lives and communities across the nation. What had begun as one buried bus had evolved into a comprehensive transformation of how America approached missing children cases, cult investigations, and survivor rehabilitation. Sarah, now Chief of Police for Cedar Valley, stood before a packed auditorium at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia. The audience consisted of detectives, FBI agents, and social workers from 43 states, all gathered for the annual Valley Springs Protocol Training Seminar. The case had become a textbook example of how persistence, community involvement, and survivor testimony could crack even the most carefully concealed crimes. The key lesson we learned, Sarah told the assembled officers, is that victims often leave breadcrumbs, even when their captors believe they've been completely silenced. Amy Jennings managed to hide evidence that would save her life 35 years later. Our job is to look for those breadcrumbs and never assume a case is too cold to solve. In the years following the initial discovery, the investigation had continued to expand in ways no one could have predicted. The cult network that had taken the Valley Springs children had operated a sophisticated system spanning 12 states and involving over 200 documented members. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had used the case to develop new profiles for identifying organized child abduction networks. Dr. Amanda Foster, the lead federal profiler on the case, had spent years mapping the psychological patterns that allowed such groups to operate undetected for decades. Her research had led to the identification of 17 similar cult operations across the country, resulting in the rescue of 43 additional victims and the arrest of over 100 perpetrators. The Valley Springs case showed us that these groups aren't random collections of disturbed individuals, Dr. Foster explained to a congressional committee examining child protection laws. They're sophisticated criminal enterprises that use psychological manipulation, document fraud, and carefully planned isolation to control their victims. Understanding their methods has allowed us to dismantle similar operations before they can cause comparable damage. The technological advances that had aided the investigation were also reshaping law enforcement. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had developed an AI-powered system called the Amy Protocol that analyzed patterns in missing children cases to identify potential cult-related abductions. The system had already flagged over 300 suspicious disappearances for enhanced investigation. Jennifer Walsh, formerly Amy Jennings, had become the public face of the survivor advocacy movement. Her foundation, Eagles Remember, had provided support and resources to over 1,200 cult survivors across North America. The foundation's headquarters in Valley Springs had become a pilgrimage site for families of missing children and survivors seeking connection with others who understood their experiences. The most important thing I've learned, Amy told a gathering of survivor families, is that healing isn't about forgetting what happened to us. It's about transforming our experiences into something that can help others. Every story we share, every detail we remember, every connection we make becomes a tool for preventing future tragedies. Amy's own healing journey had been neither linear nor simple. The first 5 years after her rescue had been marked by severe PTSD, trust issues, and difficulty maintaining relationships. She had attempted suicide twice, and had spent months in specialized treatment facilities. But gradually, With the support of Dr. Patricia Wells and other trauma specialists, she had begun to reclaim her identity and find purpose in her survival. The treatment program developed for the Valley Springs survivors had become a model for cult deprogramming centers worldwide. Dr. Wells had published extensively on the unique challenges faced by individuals who had been abducted as children and held for extended periods. Her work had influenced therapeutic approaches in 15 countries and had been translated into 12 languages. Traditional trauma therapy wasn't sufficient for these survivors, Dr. Wells explained to an international conference of psychiatrists. They had experienced not just physical captivity, but systematic identity destruction. We had to develop entirely new approaches that addressed the complex layers of psychological manipulation they had endured. The legal ramifications of the case had also been far-reaching. The successful prosecution of the cult members had led to changes in federal kidnapping laws, extending the statute of limitations for crimes involving minors and creating new categories of charges for psychological abuse and identity manipulation. The Valley Springs Amendment to federal child protection laws had made it easier to prosecute individuals who facilitated or covered up cult activities. Marcus Webb, the federal prosecutor who had overseen the case, had built his career on the precedents established by the Valley Springs prosecutions. Now serving as a federal judge, he often spoke about the case's impact on the justice system. The Valley Springs case forced us to evolve our understanding of criminal intent and victim impact. Judge Webb explained during a legal conference. We had to develop new frameworks for understanding crimes that span decades and involve complex psychological manipulation. The legal precedents we established have been cited in over 400 subsequent cases. The impact on the children who were never found remained one of the case's most haunting aspects. Despite the recovery of 4 survivors and extensive investigation, 7 of the original 14 children had never been located. FBI investigators believe that some had died during captivity, while others might be living under assumed identities, either unaware of their true origins or too afraid to come forward. Detective Mike Harrison, now retired but still working as a consultant on cold cases, maintained active files on each of the missing children. He had traveled to 6 countries following leads and had coordinated with international law enforcement agencies to track potential sightings. "We'll never give up looking," Harrison said during a recent interview. DNA technology keeps improving. Social media creates new opportunities for connection, and survivor testimony continues to provide fresh leads. Someone, somewhere, knows what happened to those children. The international dimensions of the case had surprised many investigators. The cult's network had extended into Canada, Mexico, and several European countries, leading to cooperation agreements between law enforcement agencies that hadn't previously worked together on missing children cases. The Interpol task force created to investigate international cult networks had its origins in the Valley Springs investigation. Inspector Claire Morrison of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had led the Canadian aspects of the investigation. Her team had identified a compound in rural Alberta where several American children had been held during the 1990s. While the children were long gone by the time the site was discovered, evidence found there had led to the arrests of 12 individuals and the rescue of 6 children from other cases. The Valley Springs investigation taught us that these criminal networks don't respect national borders, Inspector Morrison explained. Children could be moved between countries with ease, because the groups had sophisticated document forgery operations and extensive networks of safe houses. International cooperation became essential to disrupting their activities. The media coverage of the case had also evolved over the years. While the initial discovery had generated intense but brief coverage, the ongoing investigation and survivor advocacy work had created sustained public awareness of cult-related child abduction. Several documentary series had examined different aspects of the case, and a major Hollywood film was in development based on Amy's story. Rachel Martinez, the investigative journalist who had covered the case since its beginning, had won a Pulitzer Prize for her series of articles examining the long-term impact of the investigation. Her book, The Children Who Came Home, had become a bestseller, and had been credited with raising public awareness of the signs of cult recruitment and child trafficking. The Valley Springs story resonated with people because it showed that even the most horrific crimes can be solved, and even the most damaged survivors can heal. It offered hope to families who had given up and demonstrated the power of never forgetting the missing. The technological innovations that had emerged from the case extended beyond law enforcement. Silicon Valley entrepreneur David Kim had developed a secure communication app specifically designed for cult survivors and at-risk individuals. The app, called Eagle's Wing, provided encrypted messaging, GPS location sharing with trusted contacts, and direct connections to counseling services. Many survivors struggle with trust and communication after their experiences, Kim explained. This app gives them tools to maintain connections with their support networks while feeling safe and in control of their information. The educational impact of the case had been equally significant. School districts across the country had implemented new safety protocols based on lessons learned from the Valley Springs abduction. The Never Alone program required all field trips to have multiple staff members, background checks for all drivers, and real-time GPS tracking of school vehicles. Dr. Elizabeth Santos, who had developed the program while serving as superintendent of Valley Springs School District, had seen it adopted by over 2,000 school systems nationwide. We can't prevent every tragedy, but we can make it much harder for predators to exploit the trust that children naturally place in authority figures, Dr. Santos explained during a national education conference. The protocols we developed honor the memory of the children we lost while protecting the children we still have. The religious and spiritual dimensions of healing had also played a significant role in the survivors' journeys. Several interfaith organizations had developed specialized ministries for cult survivors, recognizing that their spiritual trauma required different approaches than traditional religious counseling. Reverend Michael Chen, who had established the Valley Springs Interfaith Healing Center, had worked with survivors from dozens of different cult backgrounds. His center provided non-denominational spiritual counseling that helped individuals separate healthy spirituality from the manipulative religious practices they had experienced during captivity. Cult leaders often use religious language and concepts to justify their abuse, Reverend Chen explained. Part of healing involves helping survivors reclaim their own spiritual autonomy and distinguish between authentic spiritual experience and manipulation. The economic analysis of the cult's operations had revealed a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had generated millions of dollars through fraud, theft, and exploitation. The children had been used not only for psychological experimentation but also for financial crimes, including credit card fraud, identity theft, and online scams. Financial investigator Margaret Thompson had spent 7 years tracing the cult's money laundering operations, which had involved shell companies in 8 countries and complex networks of cryptocurrency transactions. Her work had led to the recovery of over $12 million in stolen assets, much of which had been distributed to survivors for medical care and education. These weren't simply religious fanatics, Thompson explained to a Senate banking committee. They were sophisticated white-collar criminals who used children as tools for financial crimes. Understanding their economic model was crucial to dismantling their network. The impact on law enforcement training had been revolutionary. Every major police academy in the country now included coursework on cult psychology, child trafficking indicators, and long-term missing persons investigations. The training materials developed from the Valley Springs case had been translated into 15 languages and were used by law enforcement agencies on 6 continents. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, who directed the training program at the California Police Academy, had worked directly with Amy and other survivors to develop realistic scenarios for officer training. Traditional police training focused on immediate threats and active crimes, Captain Rodriguez explained. The Valley Springs case taught us that some of the most serious crimes unfold over decades and require different investigative approaches. Officers need to understand the psychology of long-term victimization and the complex dynamics of survivor testimony. The advancement in DNA technology had provided new hope for identifying remains and connecting survivors with their biological families. The Valley Springs DNA database had become a model for similar projects, collecting genetic samples from family members of missing children and comparing them against unidentified remains nationwide. Dr. Robert Martinez, the forensic geneticist who had overseen the project, had used advanced techniques to identify the remains of 2 Valley Springs children found at cult sites in New Mexico and Montana. While these discoveries had brought closure to their families, they had also intensified efforts to locate the remaining missing children. Every identification we make provides new information about the cult's operations and movement patterns, Dr. Martinez explained. Each piece of evidence brings us closer to understanding what happened to all of the children. The psychological research conducted on the survivors had contributed to groundbreaking advances in understanding childhood trauma and resilience. The longitudinal study following Amy and the other survivors had provided unprecedented insights into how the human mind adapts to extreme circumstances and how healing occurs over time. Dr. Sarah Williams, who had led the research team, had published findings that had influenced treatment approaches for trauma survivors worldwide. Her work had demonstrated that with proper support, even individuals who had experienced the most severe psychological abuse could develop healthy relationships and meaningful lives. The Valley Springs survivors have taught us that the human capacity for healing is far greater than we previously understood, Dr. Williams explained to a gathering of mental health professionals. Their journeys from victimization to advocacy demonstrate the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. The cultural impact of the case had extended into literature, film, and art. Multiple novels had been inspired by the story, and several television series had incorporated similar themes. The Valley Springs Memorial Arts Festival, held annually in the town, had become a platform for artists exploring themes of loss, recovery, and hope. Local artist Maria Santos had created a series of paintings depicting the survivors' healing journeys, with proceeds from sales funding scholarships for cult survivors pursuing higher education. Her work had been exhibited in galleries across the country and had helped raise awareness of the ongoing needs of survivor communities. Art has the power to communicate experiences that words alone cannot express, Santos explained during a gallery opening. These paintings honor the courage of the survivors, while helping others understand the complexity of their journey. The international conferences that had emerged from the case had created new networks of cooperation between countries dealing with similar crimes. The annual Valley Springs Symposium brought together law enforcement officials, mental health professionals, legal experts, and survivors from around the world to share knowledge and develop best practices. Chief Inspector Hans Moeller, of the German Federal Police, had attended the symposium for 5 consecutive years, using insights gained there to improve his country's response to cult-related crimes. The Valley Springs model has influenced our approach to missing children cases throughout Europe, Inspector Moeller explained. The emphasis on survivor testimony, long-term investigation, and international cooperation has been transformative for our work. The legislative changes inspired by the case had extended far beyond criminal law. New regulations governing private schools, religious organizations, and youth programs had been implemented to prevent cult recruitment and abuse. The oversight mechanisms developed in Pennsylvania had been adopted by 37 other states. State Senator Patricia Hernandez, who had championed much of this legislation, had built her career on child protection advocacy, inspired by the Valley Springs case. These children were failed by multiple systems that should have protected them, Senator Hernandez explained during a legislative hearing. Our responsibility is to strengthen those systems so that future children don't fall through the cracks. The technology companies that had emerged from the case represented a new industry focused on safety and survivor support. Amy's collaboration with various tech entrepreneurs had led to the development of multiple apps and platforms designed to help at-risk individuals maintain connections with support networks. The Guardian Network platform, co-founded by Amy and software developer Jennifer Morrison, had been downloaded by over 100,000 users worldwide. The platform provided discreet ways for individuals in dangerous situations to communicate with law enforcement and support services. Technology can be a tool for predators, but it can also be a lifeline for victims, Morrison explained during a tech conference. Our goal is to put the power of connection back in the hands of people who need help. As Chief Coleman prepared to retire after 30 years in law enforcement, she reflected on how the Valley Springs case had shaped not only her career, but the entire field of missing persons investigation. The techniques developed during the investigation had been used to solve over 200 other cold cases, leading to the recovery of dozens of missing children and the arrest of hundreds of perpetrators. Her final case report, a 500-page document detailing every aspect of the investigation, had become required reading at the FBI Academy. The report's emphasis on victim-centered investigation, community involvement, and never giving up hope had influenced a generation of law enforcement professionals. The most important lesson from Valley Springs, Chief Coleman wrote in her final report, is that every missing person matters, every family deserves answers, and every case deserves our best effort, regardless of how much time has passed. The children who came home taught us that hope is not naive optimism, but a commitment to action in the face of uncertainty. Amy continued her advocacy work, traveling the world to speak about survivor rights and cult prevention. Her message had evolved over the years from one focused primarily on her own healing, to one emphasizing the collective responsibility to protect vulnerable children and support survivor communities. "I was 8 years old when I was taken," Amy said during her keynote address at the most recent Valley Springs Symposium. "I'm 43 now, and I've spent 35 years learning that survival is not the end of the story. It's the beginning. Every day we choose to live fully, to connect with others, to fight for justice. We honor not only our own experiences but the memory of those who didn't make it home." The case files from Valley Springs now occupied an entire floor of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit headquarters, representing one of the most comprehensive investigations in the agency's history. The evidence collected had been used to train thousands of investigators and had contributed to the development of new investigative techniques that were being used around the world. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the Valley Springs case was the network of survivors, families, investigators, and advocates who had come together in its aftermath. This community had created a model for how society could respond to unthinkable crimes with compassion, determination, and hope. As Sarah stood in her office for the last time, looking out at the town that had been forever changed by tragedy and redemption, she thought about Amy's words from their most recent conversation. "You didn't just find us, Sarah. You showed us that we were never really lost. Someone was always looking. Someone always cared. Someone always remembered our names." The morning mist was lifting from Valley Springs, just as it had on that October day so many years ago. But now it revealed a community that had been strengthened by its willingness to confront darkness and transformed by its commitment to hope. The children who came home had taught them all that no one is ever truly forgotten as long as someone cares enough to keep looking, and that even the deepest wounds can heal when met with love, patience, and unwavering faith in the possibility of redemption.